themselves identifies strongly with it, but is often ascribed with that identity, is often viewed by others as having that identity by virtue of descent. And so it's not to say that it is an essential identity and that you absolutely have to be stuck with it, but there is something pretty sticky about it. And in the political context in which it operates, it tends to be viewed as something that's handed down almost on a hereditary basis. There's some discussion about whether we should unbundle these categories and not call them all part of the same category. So is religion different from ethnicity, for example? I think the mainstream work in this field tends to just conflate them all and say, I'm using the word ethnic, but I'm actually referring to religion, and they operate in the same way. Some people contest that and say there's things that are distinct about these identities that make them get activated in distinct ways or make people's behavior work differently. For example, religion is fundamentally about a worldview, right, which is different from potentially from an ethnic identity. I mean, I personally have used them kind of interchangeably the way the mainstream has, but I can see an argument about why it would operate differently. I don't think in the places where I've worked, it necessarily is that important to sit there and parse out the different ways that these work. I'll stop there.
All right. So I would say, in my perspective, identity politics is maybe even more inclusive than that. If we're going to talk about identity politics, I think it's really important to sort of say just a tiny bit what an identity is. There's a lot of different ways of approaching that. One way that I think draws on some ideas from philosophy identity and also from social identity theory and sociology and psychology is that identity is an answer to the question, what kind of person is this? Right, whether that's maybe me or you or someone, it's what kind of person is this? And there's a few things that are built into that. To say a kind implies a view of the world where there's a limited and countable number of kinds of people, right? If there are as many kinds of people as there are people, then it's not an interesting question to ask, what kind am I? Those kinds have to be relatively homogeneous inside, or else it doesn't make sense to group people by them. And there have to be relatively meaningful contrasts to the outside. So just asking what kind of person am I implies that I see the world as made up of a fairly limited set of groups that actually are quite different from each other. Because they're different and because I belong to this one, I probably think this one is a lot better than those. And so that there's a lot of sort of psychological content that's built into this. That psychological content, as far as we can tell, is activated by identities like gender, like religion, like partisanship, like social class, nationality, language, region of origin, neighborhood, sports affiliations, and a bunch of other things. Obviously, there are differences across all these different identities. But there's also a lot that works the same across all of them. It's very easy to get people to favor voting for someone based on one of these kinds of identities if there isn't much else to choose between. It's very easy to get people to favor clientelistic giving towards people who share their identity on these groups. Even really trivial groups like sports affiliation will be used to make political decisions in the absence of more compelling alternatives. So when we talk about identity politics, I think it's politics that are shaped around these group concepts. So the alternative is probably, the most common alternative is a kind of technocratic politics where we argue about issues based on the merits and sort of push back and forth on, percentages on policies and things like that, which isn't based around a group affiliation necessarily, although it can be because experts see themselves as doing this and see the other people who don't do this as bad and therefore need to be fought against. And the people who are marginalized by experts because they think about things wrong see the experts as elitists who are corrupting representation and taking the voice of the people. So even the alternative to identity politics very easily loops back around and becomes identity politics.
So just to make a connection to the seminars that we had last week, actually, Kirby Goidel was here, and he was presenting his work to very much do the empirical task of finding these groups, right? So what's maximizing the internal homogeneity and then the contrast between different groups. But his context was meanings of democracy or perceptions of what democracy means. And so he categorized these groups into like minimalist, maximalist, right? But these were not labels that people would give to themselves, I don't think. I don't think there's a group of Americans walking around saying, we're the minimalist democracy lovers, right? And so for me, that doesn't seem like it would quite reach that criteria of identity, even though it describes this relatively homogeneous group characteristic. So how is it that some shared attributes become activated as real known and subjective identities and others don't? What is the process of activating and producing these identity cleavages, and differently in different places?
Start here. Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is a really important question, and there's a lot of social science research that some of you may be familiar with. Often, it gets categorized into various labels like constructivism, instrumentalism, institutionalism, and broadly speaking, I would say there's varieties within those. Most people studying identity politics tend to fall into some variant of constructivism at this point, but with variation on the degree to which they emphasize how real the identity feels to people. So the old-fashioned way of looking at things, and the way we often hear on like cable network news in the United States, is, oh, these are these time immemorial identities. They fight each other. I work on the Middle East, so you guys may have heard of Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, if you ever follow the news about the Middle East. And you get all these generals standing up on cable network news saying, well, in Iraq, this is where the Sunnis are, and this is where the Shia are, and the reason they're fighting each other is because they had a doctrinal difference in the 7th century, and, it's always been that way. But actually, we know that's not true. And so constructivists look at what are the factors that constructed these identities, made them in particular politically salient. That's an important distinction because, we all have multiple identities, whether it's like our gender, our class, our religion or non-religion or region or whatever it might be, some of the identities that Jason was just saying, but they're not all politically relevant or salient. So constructivism is looking at the processes by which that happens, and often it focuses in general on sort of longer term, less tangible things like historical processes. One way that people have written about this is colonial practices in former colonies. The colonials would sort of single out one ethnic group and favor that ethnic group, which we know from certain basic principles of social psychology theories tends to activate the salience of that identity, especially people who are not part of that group say, we are actually this group in opposition to that group. And so that over time can activate identity, and there's any other number of ways that can occur. Another thing that gets pushed under the banner of instrumentalism is when elites, whether they're cultural elites or political elites, use identity categories explicitly for their purposes to whip up support. That does, of course, raise questions about why the identity resonates in the first place. So there's a lot to study about what's going on at the micro level that activates an identity, and some of this has to do with processes that social psychologists study at the micro level about, things like social identity theory and the importance of attachment to an identity being valuable in and of itself, irrespective of the benefits that are associated with it, feeling good about being part of this group and not that group. There are certain basic social psychological processes that get activated. And so these are sort of general categories. I mean, I could go on and illustrate how we think they're operating in specific places, but those are a couple of the ways that people talk about this.
Yeah. I think I would add to that, all of that's stuff that I completely agree with. On top of that, there's a lot of evidence that in order to have an identity, you have to have meaningful, sustained contact with the outgroup. Like, it's very hard to build an identity that's in opposition to something that you'd never see. Like, so I don't know, if you grow up in, let's say in Italy 400 years ago, it's very, very challenging to have an anti-Catholic or a pro-Catholic identity because everyone's just Catholic. Right? Mm-hmm. If you grow up in I don't know, Utah 50 years ago, you can't really identify as a Mormon very well because there's only Mormons. Utah today, you can identify as a Mormon really well because you now live in a world that's much more interconnected. And so you run into people who are not part of that category all the time. And this is really consequential for the way the politics of identity evolves in different places. If we rewind not that far, maybe 35 years, in Western Europe and the United States, there was very little negative emotion attached to Muslims. People had a lot of identity, right? They had all kinds of identity politics. But Christian versus Muslim, or in the case of much of Europe, which I think is kind of hilarious, former Christian or post-Christian versus Muslim, wasn't a relevant identity contrast because there just weren't that many Muslims that people were in contact with. The world wasn't globalized in a way where you sort of ran into different cultures just through the media. And Muslim immigration was around, but it was not that much. There wasn't a real threat. There wasn't a strong presence. And so that wasn't really a viable categorical distinction. There were other categorical distinctions. At that point in time in the U.S., the most important religious identity was actually sort of evangelical Christian versus traditionalist Christian. And in Western Europe, the most important religious category was post-Christian versus religious. So those categories are no longer nearly as politically important in Western Europe. The US one is still very important. But the one in Western Europe is no longer nearly as important because this other identity contrast has become experientially really available, right? So it's here in this room, we all love methods, right? So none of us are automatically going to think of methods versus anti-methods. But then when we go home to our departments and we have a bunch of people who never think about this, that contrast becomes salient again. And that's, I think, an important part of this.
We're going to start killing each other in the name of methods.
Please don't even think it.
So given the diversity of possible identities and these very complex social, historical processes which generate these differences, and everyone here in the room has a different context, a different research question, I guess a very quick methods question really for you guys. Based on your experience in your own work, how, when you land in a country or in a particular research context, do you go about identifying the relevant identities? And how do you pick out what I need to take account of as the factors which are motivating people in this context in terms of identity? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. We just look at a data set. No. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question because, in line with constructivist thinking, the same identity is not going to be relevant in the same place in different historical moments. I mean, I can even say this from my time doing field work in Lebanon from the early 2000s to the present. The Sunni Shia thing was just not politicized. It existed. People were Sunni, people were Shia, but literally in the time I was there, I witnessed it almost like a slow motion tape over the years, the construction of conflict along Sunni Shia lines. So at any rate, I think, there's a number of different ways we might go about this. I mean, one is, how do people identify themselves? How do political organizations identify themselves? What are the labels they use? And what are the claims that they make in the political sphere? Along what lines? Like, on what basis are they making those claims? In some places, it's easier to see than others. I mean, in some places, it's actually institutionalized in the government, like in Lebanon or other places with power-sharing systems, where power is divided ex ante across religious lines. In other cases, there's ethnic power-sharing systems. But you can, read histories of places and see the ways that people and political actors and groups have mobilized. There's also, and again, this distinction between political salience and social categories. So there's you can go to lots of places where there are social categories. People identify along different religious categories, practice them, and so forth, but they're not politicized. So I think you need to have some understanding of the context to understand what is politicized. And I would just say there's an interesting book by Andreas Wimmer that came out a couple of years ago. I can't remember the title, but the basic premise is to say, why is it that in some places this identity is politicized and other places it's not? And so he does these matched pairs of historical cases in addition to a chapter of cross-national statistical analysis, which you can possibly critique on some causal identification basis, but I think it's still compelling, which looks at why is it that, in Belgium, these categories became hyper-politicized, and, today the Belgian state it's got some challenges right now. People are not killing each other in the name of those challenges, but it's a tenuous union. Whereas in the Netherlands or Switzerland, I think is his contrast case, it operates differently with very similar religious groups present in the polity. And so he's got a historical explanation. He really engages largely in comparative historical analysis to trace the reasons why these groups became activated and sites of political difference and conflict in one place versus others. So I think you need to have some historical context and an understanding of how are people making claims in the political sphere and how are people privately practicing or in their quiet groups unpoliticized practicing.
Yeah. So I think in thinking about this, there are really different ways you can approach this research-wise. There are some sets of identities that are part of current large political coalitions, right? And identifying what those are is actually often not that hard. Those are going to be identities that are discussed routinely in political rhetoric. If you have interviews or focus groups with people, these will come up really easily. At the same time, pretty much every society, pretty much everywhere, has social movement entrepreneurs out there trying to get some identity categories that are not currently part of major political coalitions to be included. And those people can actually also be really interesting to look at. Which identities fall in each side vary in really interesting ways across contexts. So an identity that, for a lot of us we think is fundamental to social science is class, right? And class is an identity. People maybe think of this as the alternative. A lot of left-wing people in particular think of class as the alternative to identity. But then we say things like class solidarity. Well, what does class solidarity mean? It means thinking of yourself as one of this class and a member whose interests are tied to it. That's just an identity thing, right? So the extent to which people act politically as a class, as opposed to a neighborhood, ethnic group, party, blah, 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 whatever other alternatives you have, really does vary hugely across contexts. There's work by a bunch of different comparativists in different regions, people like Stefano Bartolini, Mainwaring, Pradeep Chibber, and others, who've really shown us that in some contexts, class is a very politically important identity. In other contexts, it's an almost totally irrelevant political identity. Not that people don't have a class, they still do, they just don't ever act politically around it. And what differentiates across these things? Well, this is obviously a contested domain, but it seems that leadership mobilization matters a lot. It seems that organizational structures matter. It seems the structure of the economy, how often you interact with people of your class versus cross-class in terms of the prevalent economic activities, all of these things matter. But also the availability of compelling alternative frames. Places where religion is very important sometimes squeeze out the politics of class, and so on and so forth. So when we're looking at the current coalition, we should be aware that it's going to vary, and there's a lot of reasons for that. When we look at the identities that are outside the current coalition, I think that's a lot more challenging, right? There are interesting people in Brazil, for example, trying to bring trans identities into the political debate, right? And they're not, right now, really importantly in the political debate here. But it's not out of bounds for social scientists to look at those identities and ask questions about why they currently aren't part of the political debate when they very much are in some other countries, and what would have to happen in order for them to become part of that space. So broadly speaking, I think you can't almost go wrong. Almost for sure there will be someone who identifies with whatever category you're interested in a particular place. The question is whether it's part of major political contestation or whether it's part of a social movement project looking to the future.
So given that, and given this set of tools and sort of knowledge that we have about how these processes work, that question was a little bit of a trap. Because I want to know, in the US, in Brazil, there's a sense that political scientists overlooked these politicization of new identities in terms of the working class, in terms of white identity or white nationalism, or in its many forms. Do you think that was something that could have been avoided? Is there something we could have done to identify better the degree of identification and disenchantment that fostered these politicized identities? Is there something we can learn from that experience, the recent experiences with identity politics in the US and Brazil, for example?
You want to go first?
I'll take a shot. So, I mean, with the US, I don't know for sure. I mean, certainly there were people who didn't notice this, but there's been a long trajectory of a really thriving research community documenting the extent to which, for example, around 2/3 of Republican voters in the U.S. have been motivated by racial concerns for many decades, and this is a large, expansive, and in some cases very prestigious literature. Those people definitely didn't miss it. It's also certainly true that other people did. So part of this is, I don't know, we have slightly siloed knowledge, right? So the people who work on race don't talk to the other folks, and the people who work on white behavior don't necessarily talk to the folks who work on other, non-white behavior. And that's kind of unfortunate. I wish people would get outside their boxes and talk to each other more. And I think that's part of it for sure. I think it's also true that there's a tendency to be kind of enchanted by the current political elite and to sort of buy the story that whoever the current political elite is, these people have kind of an institutional lock on power. So even if there are a bunch of people who are unhappy, I mean, if we go back 3 years in Brazil, nobody's going to say that people were happy with politics. I mean, I was here, you were here. No one was happy with politics, right? Nobody trusted any of the political elite. The problem was it was hard for people to imagine that an outsider would come in and just kind of destroy everything, right? It's hard to imagine that. In America, everybody knew that Republicans were dissatisfied with the relatively elitist, socially not far right Republican governments that they'd had for decades. But everyone also thought that the Republican Party had enough control over its nomination process that no one else would ever get through. I'm not totally sure why they thought that. In 2008 and again in 2012 and sometimes earlier, we saw movements that actually came kind of close to breaking through. But somehow it was decided that the party decides, is to quote some of the literature, and that this would never change. And I think it's important for us to actually look at, I mean, every country everywhere has these moments of disorder and chaos, right? I can point to Venezuela and everyone say, oh, well, we'll never be Venezuela. Well, maybe we will. At least partly. I hope we won't. None of us, right? But, I mean, that's a bad situation. But the political change that happened at the beginning of the Chavez period, that's a kind of event that actually happens not often, but relatively kind of often, right? Party systems actually do change every few decades. And they often change very dramatically in ways that look like that. But we fall into the spell of believing, no, it's going to be the PT versus these folks, and then it's that forever and all eternity. And I think that leads us to miss some of these things.
I think I'll...
Okay.
So I guess on a global scale, so I certainly every country thinks it has these new waves of identity politics to deal with and new challenges to the party system and everything. But thinking of the evidence on sort of the global scale, to what extent has there been a wave where we can say actually identity politics is becoming more salient, is becoming more widespread? Or is that sort of a fallacy that we see from the media? Like how much of that is a construction and how much of that is a real change in how political preferences and behavior take place? Is there evidence to help us on that question?
I don't know if I could speak. Do you have a sense of the literature globally measuring these changes? I mean, certainly there's been literature on European party systems that has been documenting sort of post-industrial politics for a while that I think suggest that there's been something brewing beyond the sort of traditional right-left spectrum for quite some time. There's an explosion of research on European politics now on the politics of migration, not just on Europe, actually. It's exploding everywhere, and a lot of that is about forms of identity, their national forms of identity and xenophobia. So, I mean, that, of course, is really spurred by the refugee crisis. But I think earlier, I mean, people were writing about this as well. from at least the 2000s as being an important cleavage. And I think there were debates in the European politics literature about the importance of class, or the declining importance of class as we traditionally understood it, and the intersection of class identities with certain cultural values as well. And debates about the degree to which those cultural values really mattered, or did they all boil down to just another form of, economic voting and so forth. So I think certainly if you look at that literature, you can think that there's been something afoot changing and certainly in European politics. I don't know if I would say, when you look at the literature on places like sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East or possibly South Asia or other regions, I don't know if we'd say there's been a radical discovery of identity politics, as people have been working on ethnic politics, tribal politics, religion, and politics for quite some time in those regions, and political Islam or whatever it might be. In Latin American politics, you guys can speak with more authority about this, but I do feel like there's been a bit of uptick in work on indigenous movements. But that's been going on for a fair amount of time. I mean, I'm thinking of Deborah Yashar's work or Guillermo Trejo, and then there's a whole new bunch of people working on this stuff. So I can't answer that question with any sort of quantitative sort of measure of, looking at World Values Survey, people reporting this in 1990 or 1995, whenever the survey project started, and now we're seeing this, and, we can debate how great those questions are and whatnot. So that I feel I'm not equipped to answer, but you do have the sense, based on looking at evolving research programs, that there has been a trend towards studying politics in much more ways that incorporate these various social identities beyond class identities.
Yeah, I think this is exactly right. We want to partition this a little bit, and we want to say in North America and Western Europe, there's really good empirical evidence that there's an increase in politics oriented around non-class identities and a decrease in politics oriented around class identities. In Latin America, there's definite evidence of an increase in what we might want to call identity politics in the form of indigenous and Afro and other movements that really want to create political space for people who've long been excluded. That is absolutely identity politics. It's not the right-wing kind of identity politics people imagine. But the growth of indigenous movements over the last decades in much of the Andean region and in Mexico, the growth of Afro movements, the sort of efforts to decenter white leadership as the default through much of the region, that is 100% identity politics, and that really does seem to be a relatively newer development through much of the region. So that literature reflects that. In Western Europe, Ronald Inglehart is absolutely doing a well-deserved victory lap right now, because he's been telling us for many decades that people are moving away from high taxes and social services versus low taxes and low social services to kind of multiculturalism and individualism versus collectivism and authoritarianism. And when we look at politics in France, the United Kingdom, Austria, well, just really much of Europe, we are absolutely seeing that as a development. In the United States, we're seeing a big change. I mean, class still matters, mainly in the form of education. Education's a big part of who you vote for in the U.S. Ironically, it's kind of flipped relative to what you might have expected once upon a time. People with lots of education mostly vote for the left party or the lefter party. People with less education tend to vote for the other party. With income, it goes the other way, but the income effect is weaker than it's ever been. And the biggest variables that determine who you vote for are race, ethnicity, and religion. Those are the most powerful variables in American politics right now, and that was not always true. So this is a significant change. It's not like the last couple years. None of these things are the last couple years. These are long trends. They're long trends that hit a tipping point, right? If you're following behavior, if you're following social movements, you see a gradual swing. If you're looking at who gets to speak in public and be heard on the floor of Congress, there's this night and day switch. And that seems much more urgent and much more recent because these changes have hit that tipping point where they're now becoming the majority debate in terms of what politics is about.
I just wanted to add two things here. And this, one of the sort of illustrates one of Jason's points. I'm sure almost none of you watched this, but in the campaign for the 2016 elections, the presidential elections, we have these conventions, right? The Democratic National Convention, the Republican National Convention. That was an unbelievable, stark illustration of the distinct positions vis-a-vis identity politics, and sort of in an Engelhart sense, at play visually. The Democratic National Convention, if you're one of these people that's into multiculturalism and tolerance and acceptance, it was like, like your parade, your party. I mean, the symbolism, the slogans, the speeches, it was so incredibly moving. We all love each other, and the people that were up on the podium speaking, like that Pakistani American guy whose son died fighting in either Iraq or Afghanistan, and was, pounding the U.S. Constitution and rights, and we're all in this together. And then you go look at the Republican convention. It's just completely diametrically opposed. So it was almost like they had, consultants from each of these clusters of identities telling you how to, project this into the event. The other thing I wanted to add is that, I mentioned that I wouldn't say there's been this radical uptick in some of the work in regions like Sub-Saharan Africa or possibly South Asia or the Middle East in the increasing salience of identity politics, but I want to actually correct what I just said. I do think there has actually, if you follow the literature, been an uptick. And this is in response to all the processes that got set in motion after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which I would say is an important critical juncture in the rise of the Sunni-Shia cleavage in the region and the rise of sectarianism. So those of us that have been studying the region for a while have been sort of seeing this thing brewing for a while. All of a sudden exploded. And recently with one of my students, we did this sort of like exercise of looking at all the scholarship in political science journals that's on the Middle East. And there actually has been an uptick in people working on identity politics and intergroup relations and sectarianism. And I think, a lot of times, basically we're ambulance chasers. We see interesting trends going on in the world and we sort of study them from a social science perspective. And so there really actually has been an uptick in this. I would say there's an earlier wave of research on political Islam, Islamist parties. So there was a different variant of identity politics that had been going on earlier in scholarship on the Middle East because people had been noticing the rise of these things. But now the identity politics literature has shifted, and now we've got all this stuff on sort of sectarianism at the micro level and at the macro level as well.
And if we wanted to throw in India, it's extremely hard to do empirical comparison over time on identity in India because survey data until like a minute ago were just very rare and terrible. But as far as we can tell, the rise of the BJP clearly reflects some kind of hardening of identity divisions compared to the period where the Congress Party that was explicitly more multicultural was the dominant force. I think that's another clear trajectory, even if it's hard to quantify in any way.
Mm-hmm. And so if it's true that we see these very increasingly salient divisions in electoral politics, in conflict zones, and also in research literature as well, around identities, one of the sort of, when I was thinking of, how politics relates to identity, one of the things that sort of seemed a counterpoint was that a lot of the collective action that we've seen in recent years has actually been less identity-based, arguably. So if you think about things like the protests here in Brazil in 2013, which started over like an increase in transport fares, and then everyone came out with their own sort of issue, right? They weren't identity-based. I don't think a lot of the, even the Arab Spring, if we think about that, I don't know if we would call that an identity-based movement, the protests in Hong Kong, even Occupy Wall Street, right? Like a lot of the collective action that we've seen around the world seems to be a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more broader in its nature. Is that something which we can make a distinction between electoral and non-electoral in terms of identity politics, or is that these just two layers moving in different moments in time? How can we reconcile these differences if we need to?
I'll just say one thing on that. One way of thinking about reconciling it, and I don't think there's a single way to do that, but one way that pops into my head is the difference between elite and mass politics. So if you look at protests that are going on in Iraq, for example, or Lebanon right now, it's very interesting because these are places that people characterize as sectarian, and they say that people's attachment to sectarian identities have risen. And I think there's empirical support for that, in part because of processes that social psychologists identify related to threat perception. So when you're being targeted as a Sunni or a Shia, you're going to identify more as one of those things. So I would say both things are going on. So there has been an uptick as a result of conflict and threat and fear in attachment to these identities, but at the same time, there's also a recognition that politicians who are playing the sect card are using it to their advantage and they're not delivering. Governance is terrible, and so people are mobilizing. And if you look at the slogans of protesters, it's all anti-sectarian, and the politicians are freaking out. The sectarian politicians who are against each other in one moment have now unified and formed a cabal to try to preserve the sectarian system and are terribly, terribly threatened by anti-sectarian slogans. They're very threatened by the notion that people might mobilize along other lines like class. And in fact, Jason said earlier that one way we can think about this has to do with the role of elites. And I think there's a lot of evidence to show that for many, many years, elites in these places have been going up and explicitly busting up attempts by non-elites to organize along alternative lines. We know that sectarian party operatives have gone into labor unions, busted them up, and then started their own labor unions along sectarian lines. So they're very threatened by this kind of mass mobilization along alternative identity lines, and so part of the process is elites trying to quash it. So I think there is this dynamic going on. It doesn't mean that unity across sectarian lines is going to persist forever, because cleavages can reemerge once things settle down or if the economy stabilizes and so forth. And a lot of this has to do with being triggered by economic crises.
Yeah. So I think obviously nothing is true everywhere and all generalizations are false, fine. But there is a lot of research that shows that even in seemingly non-identity-based movements, a lot of the time people are mobilized into those movements through identity categories. For example, you mentioned Occupy Wall Street. It turns out that most of the people who participated in Occupy Wall Street were mobilized through political groups and networks that they joined, a lot of them online, some of them face-to-face, that were identity-based. So a lot of them were there as millennials, which is an identity. It's a kind of funny identity sometimes, but it's an identity. So some of them were there as representatives of different racial and ethnic minorities. Some of them were there as representatives of different gender and sexuality minorities. But they came from the point of view of minority, or often minority, not necessarily minority, but identity-based social movements for the most part, like something on the order of 75% of the people participating, according to one survey that I saw, were there based on identity stuff, even if the ultimate claim was much broader. And there's something that they were trying to do which didn't really work, which is the kind of populist magic trick, where societies start out with all these funny divisions, right? You've got these pluralist packages of a bunch of different groups that all want different things from each other and all kind of have rivalries against each other, which makes it relatively easy for elites to constrain conflict, right? As long as you give every group something, those groups may not team up with each other because they see each other as rivals, and you can keep a system in order. And what a populist does is says, listen, these people who are running the government, running the system and running society, are taking advantage of all of you. And all the differences you think you have are tiny compared to the differences between you and them. And making that transition where suddenly the most important identity category isn't, my race, my religion, whatever, but instead, am I being taken advantage of, or am I one of the people taking advantage? You can unify people who otherwise have radically contrasting and sometimes contradictory interests into an identity movement that really can overwhelm a society. And this is something that we've seen basically throughout the history of democratic politics and in some semi-democratic situations over and over again. For better or worse, it's one of the most powerful engines for radical political change. It doesn't always work well, right? But that identity transformation is a fundamental part of the way that you get situations like what we've seen in Brazil. Maybe the protests start not identity-based, but they become a fertile ground for that new identity construction. So if you can learn how to do that, you can do a lot.
You become social movement entrepreneurs.
Yeah, you can become powerful. See, these are the secrets you learn here at Methods School.
So thinking about sort of the efficacy of these identity-based social movements. So on the one hand, we see identity politics becoming perhaps more salient, perhaps more mainstream in electoral contexts. But it also seems like sort of the big radical changes in how politics works, which we've seen with like the women's suffrage movement, with the civil rights movement, which have been such radical political moments. Do you see there being opportunities for those kind of hugely revolutionary identity movements to change political settlements? Or is it that we have this sort of more fragmented context in which each identity movement is smaller and so is less powerful individually? And so I guess my question is, do you see identity politics playing such an efficacious role in transforming the political system in the future as it has done in the past, in the longer perspective?
I'm going to think some more about that.
Sure, sorry.
I'll say a thing if you want.
Okay.
So one of the things that has changed, which makes it, so one of our past metrics for these things was the suffrage, right? Identity movements got people the right to vote. There are still places and times where that matters. Palestinians would really like to have the right to vote in the polity that actually governs them, as opposed to the quasi-polity that they're allowed to vote for. I'm not sure how to talk about that any more carefully than that. Okay, fine. But so there are some places in the world where that's still a really important metric. But in, say, the Americas, there are very few people left who don't have the right to vote. So that kind of measure for efficacy isn't going to be the right measure anymore. If we want to compare contemporary civil rights movements to the civil rights movements in the US of the 1960s, the goals are really different. And so we're going to see changes maybe not in the same way. The Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, which maybe is ending or maybe is transforming into something a little bit more conventional, is not trying to change who counts as a citizen. They're trying to change what the rights attached to universal citizenship are. Mm-hmm. And so in 15 years from now, if we look at the US and gradually over 15 years, there are now consequences to police officers who fire on civilians without adequate provocation, as opposed to the situation now where they just across the board almost universally are excused and it's fine. That would be a really important change. And if black voices are heard more in the media and on the political stage, that would be a really important change. In terms of the needs that identity movement sees right now, that would be as important as the suffrage change was. But it isn't the same kind of change. And I think that that's how we have to think about these things. Relative to the transformation people are seeking, what can possibly happen? Mm-hmm. I don't think there's any guarantee whatsoever that the things I just described will happen. But they might.
No. Yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of it is exactly more about social rights or various forms of inclusion that are beyond voting. And it also is very context dependent. So, in some places, I think it really is mobilization about either changing the formal institutional rules of the game or the operation of democracy, the quality of democracy. And in both cases, so I'm thinking here of either power sharing places, and in many contexts, power sharing is known to be a kind of dysfunctional form of governance. It's very prone to stalemate and very difficult to govern effectively and to bring about, to pass legislation or to provide public goods or whatever it is, because it has so many veto points and so forth, the way that power sharing systems are constructed. So in some places like Lebanon or Iraq, people are mobilizing against the very institutional rules of the game, which they see as ways that have preserved elite privilege and have allowed elites who are from different sectarian groups. These are not cases of one religious community or ethnic community dominating others and gobbling up all the resources. It's elites sort of having an agreement saying we elites get to divide up the pie and the rest of the country doesn't benefit. So that, I think, is, fundamentally about changing the rules of the game because of the perverse effects on governance. And I think in quite different institutional contexts, the mobilization is about the perverse effects of governance as well, but for quite different reasons. I mean, there's been a lot of research on the quality of democracy in Latin America, for example. I mean, how many studies of clientelism have there been in this region? And that's fundamentally about, perverse operation of democratic processes. And that, I think, is a shared theme around which people are mobilizing, but what they're calling for varies very much depending on the institutional context that they're in.
So maybe just to push back a little bit on this idea that it's only social rights, or mainly social rights that are in dispute in this identity politics conflict. Mm-hmm. There seems to be a number of places where it's sort of more fundamental citizenship that's at stake. So in the context of India and the recent policies to measure the population and exclude specific groups, in Myanmar with the expulsion of the Rohingya, and even in the context of the Middle East with the refugee crisis and millions of people being in the wrong country, right? Mm-hmm. How do we think about identity politics not as just a question of voting or of social rights, but also of just belonging to a certain territory or a certain part of the world? Is that something that you see increasingly either salient in the world or as the subject of research? Is that something people are looking into?
Yeah, I don't know if you want to jump in first.
Yeah, no, I mean, as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of research on immigration that looks at a lot of these questions, right, and what kinds of rights should immigrants have. I mean, it's challenging because, so take, for example, Venezuelan refugees in Brazil, right? This is a group that certainly faces an unbelievable marginalization and huge numbers of disadvantages, and that people have all kinds of identity problems with, right? These are not Brazilians. They're taking resources from everyone else, all the normal kinds of identity stuff. But the question is, where is a social movement on behalf of them going to come from? Because those folks right now are so distressed and so marginalized and so economically disadvantaged that it's extremely difficult for them to mobilize in a systematic way where they would be able to project their voice, on national media or something. That isn't really easy to create a political movement around. And that's true for a lot of these kinds of displaced and marginal and vulnerable groups that we're discussing. It's not always true, but for those groups, the identity is there. But in terms of politics, they largely operate as a relatively silent out-group. Mm-hmm. And I think that limits the extent to which they're part of some of these conversations.
I will say that I think this is launching, I absolutely agree, and there's just a structural question or set of circumstances that shapes the mobilization or non-mobilization of refugees and displaced people. I do think there's a lot of interesting work I'm starting to see emerging in political science on questions about the reception of refugees by host communities. I'm seeing more and more work. I've got, I think, at least 2 PhD students I'm working with right now on this question, not just in the Middle East, but one of them works in the Horn of Africa and Colombia. She's got a comparative project across regions. And so that's, I think, one set of very interesting questions about, what explains variation in the way communities at the subnational level receive refugees. Why are some more accommodating? Why are some extending more rights? And, some of this is contingent on the structure of the polity and the way in which, the responsibility for service delivery, for example, is allocated at different levels of government. But even when everything is quite centralized, there's still some scope for municipal governments and local communities to vary in their reception of refugees. So I think there's a lot of interesting questions coming down the pike that social scientists are addressing now on that. And also another student I'm working with has an interesting project on how the aid influxes that come with refugee crises reshape politics in the host country. So how is it that local municipal governments can leverage aid and then use it to certain political advantage and direct it in certain ways? So I think there's a lot of interesting questions this is raising, but maybe not so much about directly mobilization along social lines, more about the impact of these crises in host governments or host polities.
So maybe switching tack from focusing on the excluded, marginalized groups to sort of the other side of identity politics, which has been very much studied recently, is the declining dominant groups, right, which is sort of instantiating identity as a way of protecting their position. The U.S. Is an obvious case, but in comparative perspective, has there been variation in the degree to which this really is a zero-sum identity game which has played out? Are there some places which have dealt better with these declining groups that haven't had to adopt such strong identities, or where the institutions have been able to reconcile them better than in other places? I guess, my question is this inevitable, right? Are these identities of declining groups inevitably going to constrain the degree to which we can adapt and incorporate rising marginalized groups?
I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I really am not speaking from a base of knowledge related to relevant literature, but you're, I think, implicitly hypothesizing here. And I would imagine that, just thinking in terms of the welfare regimes literature, we know that there's different structures of welfare regimes and social rights and the degree to which social protection is guaranteed versus not, and how inclusive those rights are. And so I would just imagine that the politics of declining groups plays out quite differently in those places when people feel that they have some support. In fact, there might not even be the politicization of identities in the same way, for example, that we see in the United States as in other places with more robust social rights. That said, we know that in Scandinavia, which is usually like our utopian image of extensive social rights, that even there we have a lot of tensions, the emergence of nationalist, xenophobic movements that are anti-immigrant. So there's clearly something going on there, even when you are supposed to have the most generous welfare states. So maybe that hypothesis needs to be qualified.
Yeah, I think if we look at, so I've worked with some people who do things about this question. I've done a little bit of this myself. One of my graduate students has done some experiments where he shows white folks in the U.S. Demographic forecasts 40 or 50 or 60 years forward, and they're real forecasts, but he words them in different ways to emphasize different things. So, for example, it turns out that in the U.S., it's projected that about 50 years from now, the largest single group will be people of Asian descent. That they're going to sort of overtake white people. They're definitely going to overtake Black and Latino people. Most Americans don't know this. They don't realize that people of Asian descent are the fastest growing group via birth rates and immigration in the U.S., and that they're projected to become the plurality group at some point within this century. If you tell people that, their degree of racial threat towards Black and Latino people doesn't change. It would be nice if it went down, but it doesn't. Their degree of racial threat from Asian people goes way, way, way up. Most white Americans aren't threatened by Asian people until you tell them that actually we're in the middle of getting a whole lot more, and that the group that's finally going to be the death knell to the white majority is Asians. So, there is a tendency when you have a country that's built strongly around a majority identity category like that, there's a real tendency for this kind of threat. Experiments like this have been done that I know of in Sweden and Italy, which are very different countries, but showing forward demographic projections. In both of those two countries, you don't even see a majority flip in this century. You just see significant demographic change. Showing people those demographic projections hugely increases their attachment to their racial and ethnic identity and the degree to which they see the outside groups as really dangerous. So we see that in the United Kingdom. Clearly, the Brexit movement and sort of the Little Britain movement is really largely built around these kinds of, we've got to save the real old-fashioned English white dude, just to be blunt, I guess. But this is a tendency across a lot of these, I think we might say, colonizing countries. And I think that's important because for the colonizing countries, this original national host identity was the defining trait for the polity back in the 18th and 19th century, right? Italy was Italy when it finally became Italy because they're the Italians, and then they start trying to conquer other people who are not as good as Italians, right? And you get this as part of the dynamic of empire. The United States took over a bunch of countries because we white Christian folks knew how to do it, right? And if white Christian folks are no longer the majority, then the U.S. loses that historical definition. I think that's really crucial. We don't seem to see the same kind of, that exact kind of demographic change threat in a lot of the non-colonial, the colonized world. It does happen in some handful of places, but it's not nearly as common, it seems, as in the colonizing part of the world. Obviously, you see it in a very big way in Israel, where people are really stressed out about the question of whether there can be a sustainable Jewish majority. But I think there are little distinct reasons for that.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that, we're seeing some real pushback in the United States around affirmative action issues. So, and this, I thought of this because of Jason talking about the rise of Asian Americans. Right now, you're probably not aware of this, but there's a lawsuit against my university by ostensibly in the name of a group of Asian Americans that admissions are low compared to what they should be given academic achievement and scores and all this stuff. And for now, Harvard has prevailed and made a series of arguments related to the inherent value of diversity to the educational experience, and has prevailed in some level of circuit court. But I think the prediction is it's going to go all the way up. And it's interesting what this has provoked within Asian Americans, because there's some, of course, that are behind this lawsuit against Harvard because, that clearly some are, behind this. But there's many also who have been vocal and uncomfortable with it, and also about the essentializing role or the essentializing effect it has played in grouping together this category, which is actually quite disparate in many ways, and has many, many different national origins and lived experiences as immigrants or not, natives to the country, and so forth. I mean, as citizens. And so it's raising some really important questions. And it's interestingly, the lawsuit was organized by a man who's been organizing these lawsuits, I believe a white man who's been organizing these lawsuits across America in many different universities. And so he sort of organized the lawsuit and said, hey, Asian Americans, you want to come in and let's launch this lawsuit.
A white guy with ties to the alt-right, in fact.
Oh,
so, yeah,
yes.
This is someone whose agenda, and this is something really interesting. His agenda is to say that Black and Latino people are taking seats at Harvard that really should belong to Asian people. Whereas, I mean, if you look at the actual Harvard admissions, if anyone's taking those spots, it's white folks. Like, its legacy admits due to people whose great parents and grandparents gave a lot of money to Harvard and stuff like that. But the way the lawsuit is set up, it's Black and Latino people are squeezing out Asian people, and it's creating this rivalry among minority groups, which is a really cool example of how identity politics is just totally nasty sometimes.
And athletes, too. That's the
other
athlete,
and that's right, absolutely.
Legacy
athletes,
and athletes.
So certainly affirmative action is one of the sort of policy tools that has been used to sort of manage identity politics and try and reconcile and in the longer term, hopefully, reduce those inequalities. I guess, as we're all good sort of comparative politics students, the other tool, institutional tool that we've been taught is consociationalism, right? As an institutional form of power sharing where we sort of guarantee representation for specific identities. And there's always been a debate about, well, does this just reinforce those identities and this conflict, or does it actually lead to more compromise and incorporation over time? That literature is quite an old literature. I don't know if there's more recent work on this, but where do you guys see that debate? Is consociationalism still a realistic form of government for developing countries which could seek to minimize identity politics?
Yeah, no, I have a lot to say about this. I spent a couple of weeks in my class last semester talking about this. I've written an article related to this as well. But at any rate, I won't go on and on, but I think the punchline in a lot of the literature has been great for stopping people from killing each other, bad for governance, right? So especially when you have a conflict, violent or otherwise, in which there's a relative balance of power. This is a solution that is heavily promoted by policymakers and others because you have kind of a stalemate and a relative balance of power. It's a different story when you have decisive victory from one side, like in Sri Lanka or Rwanda or something like that. But when you have a number of groups that have rough equivalent of power and could act as spoilers in any other kind of system, it makes sense. This is a thing that brings everyone to the table, and it sounds really good. Divide up power, it's very inclusive. But what happens is you build in, by design with consociationalism, all these rules like veto power that make it, in practice, very difficult to actually pass legislation to get things done, and also structure it, as I was alluding to earlier, in such a way that the elites develop vested interests in the system and start to ignore mass interests, except those that you also tend to see these networks, patronage networks along the lines of the consociational system, if it's religion or ethnicity. So we see this in Bosnia, we see this in Lebanon, we see that. Northern Ireland, too, is really, at an impasse, and I think recently just reinstated a government, but it's not functioning well at all. In Belgium, all kinds of other examples. So I think a lot of people argue that it's actually a perverse system, but it's a dilemma because, especially when you're dealing with post-conflict situations or conflict situations, it may be the only thing that induces people to come to the table and talk. So I think there's a real catch-22 here. And there's some reason to believe theoretically and possibly empirically that it does increase the salience of identities. For example, Evan Lieberman and Prerna Singh have this paper they wrote in World Politics in which they look at the role of formal institutionalization of identity in various government institutions, right? So like whether it's identity cards or power sharing or constitutional rights, whatever it might be, they argue that this is associated with an increasing salience of the identities in question. I think in practice, if you look on the ground, like take Lebanon for an example, obviously people are multifaceted. They have multiple identities. But clearly, there's scope for politicians to mobilize along these lines if, for example, your access to benefits or your political rights or whatever it might be are structured along these lines.
Yeah. So I think if we look at kind of I think it's hard to say that there's like a big global trend towards consociationalism at this point. A lot of the countries you talked about have had those institutions in place for there may be a couple new ones. There maybe is a bigger trend in terms of institutions to try to manage these issues towards electoral quotas, where we're going to say, all right, you have to elect at least such and such people from this group and such from that group and the other, to try to make sure that identity politics doesn't sort of push people out of the conversation and that there's at least someone at the table representing different groups. And I think that there's really interesting evidence that actually has a lot of perverse effects. So it turns out there's a big literature at this point which shows that, for example, quotas for racial and ethnic and religious minorities almost only elect men. Quotas for women almost only elect usually white women, but whatever the dominant woman is, or dominant sort of highest ranked racial or ethnic group is within the group. And so this ends up pushing really away from a kind of intersectional idea that we all have lots of different identities at play and that those things might be represented in different ways, towards an idea where each of us picks our most important identity and we're represented only in terms of that. And I think long term that's actually really scary and threatening. Because long term, the best way to deal with, we're never going to prevent identity politics. We can't deal without it, right? We need it. We need identity politics to simplify the world and build coalitions. But the best way to deal with identity politics is for all of us to be aware all the time that we have lots of different competing identities and that those pull us in different directions with different coalitions. So that I never feel like you are always the enemy. I feel like on this you're the enemy and on that you're my friend. And quotas, as well as consociationalism, pull us away from that kind of plural identity towards single sort of dominant identities that are deeper. This is an old idea in comparative politics, right? This is reinforcing versus cross-cutting cleavages. And we really want the cross-cutting version of cleavages. So institutions that push us towards reinforcing or single dominant cleavages can be really threatening to the long-term stability of a country.
Can I just say one thing about that? Sure. So I think, in some of these places where ethnic or religious politics have been politicized and, institutions have been implemented to try to address that, some people advocate for, my chair just suddenly went down. Some people advocate for integrative electoral systems, like Donald Horowitz is the big proponent of this, whereby politicians from one group are required to garner votes from the other groups in order to hold electoral office. And actually, interestingly, Lebanon has this in its electoral system design. But, those two are subject to perversion because elites can form cabals with each other and pre-electoral arrangements and subvert them. So it gets tricky. I mean, absolutely, I think, this is a tool in the policy toolbox to address these things, but it can also get subverted.
Those tricky elites, we better get them.
Yeah. Are you starting a revolution on
I'm just trying to build an identity.
All right. So I think maybe a final question. So Melani, you mentioned Rwanda. And I guess Rwanda has actually a very different model of dealing with identity politics, which is not allowed, right? Like, it's illegal. You cannot mention ethnicity, race in political conversation or in actual daily conversation, really. To what extent, that seems to have been very successful in that actually it's gone along with actually other identities being represented. So it has one of the highest female representation of lawmakers in the world, for example. Does this therefore seem like there's actually an alternative model, which is the sort of the light authoritarian model of eliminating identity politics through fiat and through enforcement by the state? Is that something that is a sustainable model? Because certainly it's being looked at in African politics, at least, as a desirable and effective way of avoiding identity politics. Is that a big mistake, or is that a model for the future?
It's interesting because I think for a while, Rwanda has been like the darling of the international development community, and they've achieved so many things, and female representation and development gains and so forth, but definitely comes alongside this authoritarian model. And so I remember several years ago being at a conference with a senior official from the World Health Organization, and she was really disenchanted with Rwanda as a model, and I think increasingly many people in the development community have been, because they see this as coming with a price of, a very big political price of suppression and very undemocratic politics and not inclusive whatsoever along many lines. So I think it's a complicated story. And I don't think it's wiped out identity politics. I think it's suppressed it. Recently, I read an article about the gacaca courts, the courts that are used for transitional justice in Rwanda, where building on sort of models that were allegedly indigenous models of reconciliation. And this person who wrote this article spent, I think, 10 years carrying out ethnographies of these courts. So it was quite an impressive set of data collection. He went to all these different communities. And he found that people were talking about ethnic identity. They were just doing it in very careful ways, and when state officials were not around and when certain people from the community were not around. So I don't think it's eliminated it. I think it's just suppressed it. And people have talked about this with respect to Syria or Iraq, for example, where you had these Arab nationalist governments that said, we don't have identities whatsoever. But then when you look under the hood and see what's actually happening, there is identity politics. I don't know that there's evidence in Rwanda that Kagame is actually funneling more resources to Tutsis, but certainly people have done some analyses of where resources have gone under Saddam Hussein or Hafez al-Assad or Bashar al-Assad in these countries, and find evidence, especially in the sanctions period on Iraq when resources were increasingly squeezed. Saddam Hussein started playing the identity politics card to shore up his support and outsourcing control to tribal leaders and religious leaders. And so it started coming back and never fully went away, but particularly under conditions of economic constraint, it started popping up again.
So I would say, in a lot of the identity literature, the most the most interesting authoritarian experiment on identity politics is maybe Singapore, which has a system where everyone is classified as CMIRO, so that's Chinese, Malaysian, Indian, or other. And every single floor of every apartment complex, every block of every residential area is set up. I mean, there's deliberate authoritarian control over which category of person can live in each place. Usually we would expect that to mean, oh, this is a C neighborhood, this is an M neighborhood. It's the opposite. Every floor of every building has to have C, M, I, and O. Everyone has to live next to everyone. It's against the law to denigrate another group. So there's like a couple of years ago, there was an Australian professor who was kicked out of Singapore for complaining about on Twitter about a Malaysian wedding that kept them up all night, because they called it a Malaysian wedding that was so loud. So that was denigrating another group, and you can't do that, and he gets kicked out. And this is a context that had significant intergroup conflict and violence even 40, 50 years ago. And that seems to have largely dissipated. That there seems, as far as we can tell, because good social science is a little bit difficult there, but it seems to be the case that the national identity of the Singaporean project has become more important to most residents than their CMIO identity, although those identities are still reinforced by the state. Which category you belong to determines the language that you get taught at school in addition to the national language. So everyone has their own additional language they have to learn. And if you're from China but you're not from the right part of China and you speak the wrong Chinese, your kids may grow up speaking a different Chinese than you do because the state imposes that. So there's a very, very heavy authoritarian flavor to this. But in contrast with some of these other places where it seems to be like a temporary holding pattern, this one seems to probably be producing what will be a long-term transformation of identity structures. I'm not advocating this by any means, but it's a really interesting, extreme example in the identity space.
Is there anything else you guys would like to say, or we can open it up for questions? Yeah. Okay, so we've talked too much, and I know there are people in the room who study identity politics or have worked in this space. So please, what questions do you have for our panel? And please identify yourself before you ask your question. Not by ethnicity or identity or anything, but just by your name. I didn't mean that to sound
or whichever one is most salient to you at the moment.
Competing identities here. Okay, so thank you very much for organizing this roundtable, which is a very important and salient topic. My name is Denise Delgado. I'm a public policy PhD student at UMass Boston, and I am studying about the Cuban Americans and their transnational participation. So I wanted to know if you have any comments, or you could suggest any literature on transnational identity or transnational political identity. I mean that how immigrants do influence politics in their countries of origin. Mm-hmm.
Do we have other questions to collect a couple?
There was one.
Yeah, let's take 2 or 3 and then respond.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Ricardo from Rio de Janeiro State University, and I just want to listen you guys about a point that Jonathan touched briefly, that in the past or the last century, identity politics was much about inclusion and ensuring civil rights, political rights, and more recently there is this. I'm not advocating that I agree with this critique, but I just want to hear what you guys think about it. Recently, identity politics became so much present, and there is this sectarism and fragmentation of the progressive forces or social forces that in some extent has undermined the civic culture. And so there is this. So if in the past identity politics was about inclusion, now it has become about division and fragmentation. And at some point, there is Mark Lilla, I think, there's the historian from Columbia, has a book about the end of liberalism and identity politics, and he blames, in some extent, the identity politics for Trump winning in 2016. So I don't agree with that, but I would like to hear what you think about this critic.
Yeah.
Should we get one more?
Yeah, one more over here.
Hi, thanks. I'm Chin Huat from Malaysia. I study identity politics, but I find the discussion very interesting. My questions, I have two questions. One, you mentioned about that even class has identity dimension. Would you see green as an identity?
Okay.
Environmentalism. And second question is that if identity can be used across all these dimensions, would it not become tautological? Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Oh, should I pass the mic down so you guys?
Well, let me see. I'll just say a couple of things. I mean, I'm trying to think of literature. Maybe more will come to me later. But like Devesh Kapoor at UT Austin has some work, I think, looking at remittances. So that might be relevant. So that's the thing that pops into my head. I think there might be some work on Tamils abroad and their support for the Tamil movement in Sri Lanka. So, that's a different context than what you're talking about. Maybe the remittances stuff is more relevant. And certainly in the case of Cubans, there have been like active mobilization to try to overthrow, the state. So that's a whole other set of issues. So I think, the point being that diasporas can be involved in multiple ways, supporting resistance movements, trying to work with their host country government to overthrow their government of in the country of origin. It might be that remittances are going back and having political effects and so forth. So I don't know a lot about this literature and if there is even much on this, but that's a couple things that pop into my mind. I was actually thinking of that Mark Lila book when you asked that question, and then you came out with it. So, I think it's an interesting question. I think, a lot of people would come back, like Danny Roderick and others, economists, and say, it's fundamentally about economic issues that maybe get wrapped up with identity issues, like the formation of identities, whether it's like marginalized, excluded rural identities, populist identities. So I think, folks might come back and present a different picture. And the other thing that I think this raises is interesting questions also raised by Jason's discussion of the Singaporean model, which is, there's many different ways that you can construct, have multiple identities operating. And so it may be that one model is to heavily promote a shared national identity while also respecting cultural rights of groups and so forth. So that might operate differently than movements in a different context. I think the rise of the identity politics movements that he's referring to, whether it's like feminist movements or LGBTQ or all these other identity movements, are also refracted in a particular context in which you have the rise of white nationalist identities that are reacting to those and feeling marginalized and feeling social mobility prospects going down and feeling under threat. So it's sort of an interactive dynamic there. The last point about tautology, possibly, but I do think what we're talking about is variation in the degree to which one is activated over another. So I think that's sort of the way I would think about it, rather than sort of one overarching category.
Yeah. So I think in terms of this kind of diaspora and identity politics thing, there's a bunch of people on this. One person I'd refer you to actually is one of our current grad students at Northwestern who's on the market this year, Rena Curry, who's doing some work on how refugees in camps, refugees from Syria in camps on the bordering countries, how they participate back in the Syrian conflict and what are the identities and the identity changes that come with changes in aid that change the way they act in participation. So she's cool and she's interesting, but also she'll be able to point you to some other people maybe. I think that would be all right. In terms of this question about sort of is identity politics fragmenting the left, this is an interesting one because if we go back to, I don't know, the good identity politics of, say, the 1960s when it was the civil rights movement, there actually were some writers on the left who made exactly the same complaint. They would say, well, we really need to be supporting the union movement, all this stuff about African American civil rights and, churches and all this. It's a sidetrack. We need to get economic equality first, and that will raise all boats. But it was never going to raise all boats, right? I mean, the way that racial exclusion worked in the United States, whenever progressive policies were passed, they were always passed in racialized ways. We think about maybe the New Deal under Roosevelt, and this is this great progressive moment where there's these jobs programs and this huge expansion of the welfare state. And all of it was set up in ways where it was very easy to exclude African Americans, who for the most part received no benefits and often only paid costs. After the war, there was the GI Bill and support for housing for veterans. Again, African Americans got none of it. So what point down the line do we get enough equality economically that African Americans now count as citizens? It was never going to happen. So I think there's a similar argument to be made today. Of course, whatever, identity matters. I have identities that are politicized today. I'm a religious minority. In some various ways, I'm kind of a sexuality and gender minority. And so some of the debates that are at the core of people being uncomfortable around identity politics in the United States are really personal to me, right? I really want it to be the case that conversion therapy is outlawed. And actually now today, it's outlawed in nearly every state in the United States. I think there's one left where it isn't outlawed for kids. Adults can do it if they want, but kids can't be made to do it anymore. That is a huge victory to me. Nobody is losing ground because of this. Trump wasn't elected because we're banning conversion therapy. But that's a big victory for an identity group that suffered because of their identity, an identity that you can only partly choose. And that political mobilization really has made a major change in the world. I mean, that the mobilization around LGBTQ rights has a bunch of policies that are no longer even controversial, right? Like, the anti-hate crimes laws that are covering much of the world at this point were really controversial even 30 years ago. Now, in most of the world, it's just taken for granted by left, right, and center that we shouldn't be beating up gay and lesbian people in the street. That is great, because that's a change where we've become more inclusive in a way that I think doesn't defeat other agendas on the left or whatever we care about. And then finally, really quickly, is green an identity? It certainly can be. I mean, there absolutely are people who define themselves in part around their environmentalism. A lot of those people may not actually be particularly efficient as environmentalists, right? But if you conspicuously consume environmentally friendly products, then that is clearly an affirmation of an identity. Mm-hmm. Other people do environmental activism without a particular identity commitment. They may just, okay, I wasn't saying anything about anyone in particular. No, other people are involved on specific issues where, for example, they have a huge amount of expertise or a personal investment. They want to protect a rainforest where they've lived. They want to protect some wildlife. There's some animal that they love. And those things aren't necessarily identity. So I think we're really far from the realm of tautology. There's all kinds of political action that isn't noticeably identity-based, although a lot of political action is identity-based. But even when identities are important, there's a clear distinction between the identity and the outcome. To say that I'm an environmentalist doesn't necessarily imply that I vote in any particular way, or that I buy a particular thing, or that I see other people as my people. So we can still make those relationships without running into tautology, I think.
Do we have time for one more round of questions? We probably have a few minutes left before coffee break, if anyone has a question.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm going to read it, or otherwise I would get confused. It seems to me that your solution, or I don't know, I'd say prescription on how to grow safer political spaces between different identities is based on, let's focus on another common enemy, not between ourselves. Like, look, elites are taking advantages on us, like you gave us example.
Yes, okay.
And it seems to me that it's a very appealing alternative when we're talking about different religions or different classes, social classes. On the other side, I recently read Professor Haight's book, Social Psychology stuff, and his prescription on growing safer political spaces relates to let's tolerate ourselves, our differences, our different values, and things like that individually. And I would like to to listen to you talk a little bit more how to grow this. What do you do? What would you say that's a good alternative to grow this kind of safer spaces in contexts in which the political values are the differences, the identities, and considering that political rhetoric is mostly based on contrasting on building these differences between people based on their values, the different values.
Anyone else? Natalia at the front and then at the back.
So I'm Natalia, a PhD candidate here at the Political Science Department. Congratulations on the organizing committee for putting up this table. This discussion. I'm very excited. So my question is, so a lot of literature concerning power sharing and identity entrenchment and all kinds of redefining identities. My question is your personal take on the differences between corporate consociationalism and more liberal kinds of institutional designs. So would you think, thinking about Lebanese case, is this the kind of corporate consociationalism that will not work, but probably other types of more liberal institutionalist design might not entrench identities as much?
Hi, my name is Bruno. I'm from the Department of Sociology. I'm a PhD candidate. My question is, during the talk, both professors talked about the political salience of identity in some contexts. And Nancy Fraser, American philosopher, says that because of this political salience of identity, there's a risk that identity become a thing, like reification of identities. And so she suggests that instead of using the idea of identity politics, like politics towards identity groups, she talks about recognition policies or redistribution policy, and more recently representation policies. And she instead of focusing on groups, she focusing on parity of participation. So what you think about this, criticism against identity politics and the idea of parity of participation? Thank you.
Feel free.
Okay. So, I mean, there's a lot. I'm going to try to remember everything that was said, but there's a lot here. So your question, your observations raised for me, some thinking I've been doing recently about particularly the experimental literature on intergroup relations and promoting intergroup tolerance. And so there's a number of a relatively small number of theories in social psychology that have been invoked as a foundation for interventions, often in field experiments, to promote intergroup tolerance. So one of the common ones, and it reminds me a little bit of the Singapore example, is the contact hypothesis, which is associated with this guy Allport from, I think, 1954, but there's been a ton of work on this and many meta-literature reviews and so forth, and many field experiments have happened recently and are in the field right now and so forth, trying to test this. And basic idea is when you put people from different groups together under certain conditions. He lays out a variety of conditions when they're in cooperative settings, when they're relatively equal, when they're working on something positive. I think there's a few more conditions. Then you can promote better intergroup relations, more tolerance, and so forth. So people have been testing this in very interesting ways. I probably don't have time to go into examples. There's one that's in Iraq that's getting a lot of attention. There's, Betsy Paluck's work in Rwanda and elsewhere has got a lot of attention. So that's one thing. Another theory is promoting a supraordinate identity, which I think was implicit in your point. So that's another thing, is when you try to promote a supraordinate identity, but often it's in opposition to something else, as you said. So that seems to be a very effective method for promoting a supraordinate identity, pitching against something else. So, maybe certain groups in Europe were in tension with each other, and then along came all the Muslim refugees, and now they're Islamophobic collectively and no longer are in tension with each other. So, so there's costs to these things, and there's, I think, some of these meta-analyses suggest that the contact hypothesis works. On average, under certain conditions. The question is whether the interventions to promote it work. And there, I think the record is more mixed for a variety of reasons that those of you that study experimental methods will be well aware of. Maybe the intervention works for a period of time and then drops off and stops working, or maybe it's, the external validity is really limited, the context really matters, so the intervention works in some places but not in others. So there's, really interesting, important insights from these interventions that are often conducted with NGOs in post-conflict settings to promote better relations, but they have some critiques as well. And my conversations with the policy community is they're well aware of those limitations and they're concerned about them and they want to pay more attention to context. So that's, one set of thoughts I have in response to some of the things that you said. And now I am blanking on other questions. So the consociationalism versus sort of a more liberal model. That's how there's an alternative model. I think we've talked about this before, the power dividing model, which is much more based on like sort of a federal system where you devolve rights and really emphasize individual rights. It's kind of like the U.S. system that some people have proposed for post-conflict societies as an alternative that doesn't reify these identity categories, and it sounds really interesting. I think the problem with these institutional designs is they may work, but there's a politics behind getting them implemented. So, it's not that institutional design just flies in and gets plunked down. There has to be a set of political arrangements on the ground that makes the local actors receptive to adopting them in the first place. So that, I think, is a really important question, which is, we may dream up the best institutional design in the world that will work, but will it be adopted, and then will it be implemented the way it's supposed to be implemented, like my Horowitz integrative electoral system example. And your point was about maybe other ways of so the one thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, and I'm sure Jason has a lot to say, is that, there is a fair amount of research on this. Like, I think Andreas Wimmer's big thing is representation. So when you get places that have more representation across the groups in society that are present, then you're more likely to have smooth political relations and fewer grievances and tensions that erupt as a result of that. And that's part of his comparative historical analysis, is why is it that in some places you just have more representation that evolves for often historically contingent reasons, in some places that just makes these categories apolitical or relatively unpoliticized, and in other places there's been much more exclusionary politics for various historically contingent reasons, and therefore they get more politicized.
Yeah. So I think I'll start answering with your question as well, if that's all right. I think in thinking about this, it's really useful to separate sort of action coming from the state to society from action that originates in society. I think a lot of these ideas are really useful when we're thinking about state action, that we don't necessarily want states to be adopting and reinforcing identity categories, because, history teaches us that almost always involves favoring some over others, that these distinctions last for a very long time when the state puts its signature on them, and that they can become really harmful. And so that getting the state to move in the direction and some other frameworks for dealing with difference might be really valuable. From the point of view of society, it's very hard to mobilize groups a lot of the time without an identity appeal. I'm not saying you can't do it, But I am saying that identity appeals are one of the most powerful ways to socially and politically mobilize people. And a lot of the changes we've seen in the direction of democracy and in the direction of inclusion around the world come from movements written in the language of identity. You know, the democratic movements in Latin America at the beginning of the 20th century and more recently had a lot of identity appeal, a lot. You know, a lot of these movements are mobilized in these terms. And so, you know, as the philosopher Appia says, identity simply isn't something we can do without. When we're thinking about society, identity can be really dangerous. But to get rid of identity is to put ourselves in a world where whoever has power right now is going to have it forever, probably, because no one can mobilize to contest them very well. So I think that's how I'd want to maybe respond to that. In terms of your question, I'm joking a lot about sort of populist stuff because it's such an important identity move in the world. And it can be a really powerful solution when societies are deadlocked. It can create inclusion. We can look at things like Bolivia, where during the populist period there was a huge expansion of inclusion of indigenous people. And then we can also say, yes, but all the other stuff, and that's fine, and that's a conversation to have. I don't have a solution to offer here. I can try to analyze different things, but like, what's the right thing to do? I guess in my personal politics, I'm the very boring thing. I'm kind of like a pluralist liberal in terms of identity. I think we ought to try to be tolerant and listen to each other and take account of other people's needs. And I think that goes a long way. I don't think that kind of individual thing solves everything in the world, so I don't really have the solution. But, you know, there are a lot of things people have tried. I can tell you for sure that some of them are terrible and disastrous, right? Like white nationalism, that's a real bad policy. Let's not do that one, right? But there's a bunch of solutions, a bunch of strategies to dealing with identity that haven't really been given a serious try. And some of those are institutional and some of them are society driven. And I think we're going to see people experimenting with a lot of those. And I'm looking forward to seeing how they work.
Well, I think a huge thank you to our participants and to you guys as well for your questions, which have been awesome. And thank you especially to Melani, who's battling through, I think, and should really be resting. So, but thank you very much, guys. That was wonderful. Awesome. I think we have coffee break outside, right? So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. That was really
wonderful.
interesting.
Thank you. No, thank you for
super interesting.
Excellent answers. I'm not sure about the questions, but the answers were great.
No.